The title of the talk today is The Interplay Between Illocutionary Force and Information Managing, a comparison of the pragmatic functions of Italian un po', meaning a bit, and European Portuguese la, meaning there. So this presentation is part of the research project that I'm doing as a postdoc researcher at CLUL, and this is the structure for today's talk. After an introduction about discourse-pragmatic elements, I will focus on the functions of modal particles, which is the category that I will be using to describe some examples today. Then I will present some of the modal uses of Italian un po', some of the modal uses of Portuguese la, and after that I will give an overview of the pragmatic functions of both elements and draw my conclusion. So, the starting point for this talk, or let's say the broader research field, is the research field about discourse-pragmatic elements, that is, linguistic elements that don't refer to anything in the external reality, but they are rather involved in facilitating the spontaneous speech production, in managing different aspects of the interaction, or managing the relationship between the speaker and the hearer. We can see these in examples 1a and b. There are two different uses of the same English adverb, well. In 1a, she's doing well. It's the adverb of manner, denotating something in the reality of the state of affairs. And the second one, 1b, is rather a use of well as a discourse marker, where it is used to set something in the conversation, to manage the turn or something like that. And in the literature we can find many different pairs of concepts to describe the opposition between these two different uses of the same element, such as conceptual versus procedural meaning, content level versus context level, or propositional level versus communicative or discourse level. Particularly useful Hansen's definitions, like she used this opposition between content level use of a linguistic element and context level use. And by the first concept, we refer to any use of a linguistic item in which the meaning of that item refers to the state of affairs in some real or imagined world, or to the relationship between two different states of affairs. On the other hand, context level use refers to any use of a linguistic item which expresses the speaker's comment on the relation between a described state of affairs and the discourse itself, or the wider speech situation. This opposition will be used to categorize some of the examples in this talk. Then, in the literature, there is an ongoing debate about the categorization of discourse-pragmatic elements. This table is just one of the possible proposals, but it's one that I feel comfortable with. And Kriebel used the label pragmatic markers as an overarching category, and then we have different boxes. And here I wrote some Portuguese examples for each category. So we have interjections, modal particles, discourse markers, response signals, and politeness expressions. And among these, the category that is particularly relevant for today is the one of modal particles. Modal particles have been often defined in contraposition to discourse markers, which is maybe not the best approach to do that, but sometimes it's useful. And this one, I think, is a very good definition to frame this opposition. And on the one hand, we have discourse markers which are defined by functional criteria and only by functional criteria, while the definition of modal particles always includes also formal criteria, such as the syntactic position in the sentence. And yes, unlike discourse markers, which indicate a two-place relations between sequentially ordered discourse chunks, modal particles mark a relationship between a speech act and some element in the common ground, which is usually belief, that is a proposition, attributed to the addressee. What does that mean?
We can see it in example 2 in German, where there are 3 different occurrences of the particle ja, which can be used both as a discourse marker and as a modal particle. The first one and the last one are discourse markers. They basically have the function of introducing and closing the utterance, while the one in the middle, which is close to the main verb, is a modal particle and can be translated with something like "we know that." But basically it marks the fact that this whole utterance expresses a content which is obvious or already known to both the speaker and the addressee, while the other two, like the first one, like the beginning and the last one, are more sequential, no? Like they open and close the utterance. Here is a list of features of modal particle, formal and functional features, mainly based on German literature, because German has been like widely studied on these topics. So for the formal side, modal particles are non-inflecting elements, syntactically integrated. They usually cannot carry stress, and they cannot be negated or coordinated, but they can be serialized. They can appear one after the other. And on the functional side, modal particles have sentential scope, or better, they have scope over the speech act. They are restricted to certain sentence or illocutionary types, only interrogative sentences, declarative sentences, and so on. They do not have referential meaning, and in this sense, they make no contribution to the propositional content, but to something else. And we will see what this something else is by introducing these 2 categories that appear in the title of the talk, that is illocutionary force and information managing. So, on the one hand, the functions of modal particles have been defined with reference to illocutionary categories. Usually a single modal particle can appear only in a subclass of illocutionary types, that is only in imperative and declarative sentences, or only in declarative and interrogative, but not in all the types, but like there are exceptions for sure. And when it appears in one of these types, it usually has the functions to further specify the illocutionary types, like in example 3. Without the particle ja, this one is a stressed one, the sentence would be a default imperative clause without any further specification. It could be an order, a request, a piece of advice, and so on. But with the particle, this illocutionary type is made more precise. It makes the imperative clause a specific directive, in this case a cogent order. For this reason, sometimes modal particles have been defined through categories such as mitigation and reinforcement, which is sometimes good, but sometimes it's also not so precise, let's say. No, like these categories have the advantage of being very intuitive, but sometimes are poorly defined, so we will try not to use them too much. On the other hand, modal particles have been defined with reference to this category, information managing. What does that mean in this case? It has been argued that modal particles establish an indexical relation to a particular proposition, which is a logical variant of the proposition in which they appear. What does that mean? That if we look at example 4, the sentence in 4a, Deutsch ist eben schwer, and yes, German is difficult, should be put in relation to the sentence in 4b, German is difficult. In this sense, by using the modal particle, the speaker marks the fact that the proposition where it appears is marked as given, as communicatively presupposed, as a particular type of pragmatic presupposition. And in this way, the presence of the modal particles marks the fact that this utterance, like for A, is non-initial, is a kind of a reaction in a dialogic structure which can be explicit in conversation or just a mental thing. Moreover, each modal particle has some lexical feature, no? And like every single element says something about this relationship, about how the utterance should be interpreted in the context of interaction. In this way, we can have different paraphrases for each particle. These are again German examples, but it's almost over with German. So the particle eben means something like I repeat this. The particle aber, in contrast to the opposite assumption, ja, we all know, schon, these and other things, old, and so on. Or we can also have more abstract paraphrases, and in this way, the presence of the particle ja indicates the fact that the speaker assertion is obvious to the addressee, the presence of doch, that the speaker's assertion should be obvious to the addressee, and so on. No? Like these are the lexical feature of every single particle, given the fact that each one activates as a presupposition, like the same proposition without the modal particle. So let's say that a more general or simple way to frame this is that modal particles work as markers of common ground management. That is, they operate on the relationship between the speaker and the addressee. They don't modify the prepositional part of the sentence, but they rather highlight what the speakers assume is part of the hearer's opinion or belief. No? So far we gave German example because, as I said, German has been intensively studied on these topics. But in Romance languages, we do find some of these particles, not as much as in German, but several studies have pointed out some examples. We have examples of Spanish modal particles, French, Italian, Portuguese, and they perform different functions. Let's say sometimes they modify the illocutionary force, sometimes they work more as common ground managers, and so on. So we can skip this, and we can, given this background, frame the research directions for this talk. No, let's say that at the general level, it is part of a broader investigation of modal particles in Romance languages, which aims at giving a description of formal and functional features of the modal uses of adverbs in terms of context of occurrence, pragmatic functions, conversational routines, and development paths. And for today, we will take as examples two expressions, like this Italian adverb un po' and the European Portuguese adverb la. And we will try to distinguish content level and context level uses. We will try to outline a comparative approach to their pragmatic functions, and we will try to assess to what extent they can be defined modal particles. And this should be part of an input for a cross-linguistic account of modal particles and similar elements. So let's have a look to a couple of examples to understand better what I have in mind. So the first one is an Italian examples. In example 11, there are two occurrences of un po', of this adverb. And we can say that the first one is a context level use of the adverb, while the second one is a content level one. So the second one, the blue one, is referential. The first one is not referential. In particular, in the second case, un po' più vicino, un po' works as an adverbial modifier that modifies another adverb, più vicino. In this way, closer is a bit closer. While in the second one, in the first one, this doesn't hold. Un po' doesn't modify the reference of the verb. It's not like the verb is metti, to put. And in this case, it's not the reference of the verb that is modified. It's not put a bit, like do a bit of this action, but it's rather the illocutionary force that is changed. And in a similar fashion, I hope it's not too small, here is the Portuguese examples with two different occurrences of la. In the first case, the blue one, It is the prototypical use as a deictic locative. Na noite do fados, estavam lá familiares nossos. It's a special reference. And I will not read the whole example because it's just for my pronunciation. But in the last sentence, like in a row, there are different verbs modified by la. And in this case, la doesn't refer to a point in the space, but it's rather used to add some subjective evaluation towards the state of affairs expressed by the verb. So this is more or less what I have in mind. And we will see that despite the fact that the content level use of these two elements belong to very different semantic domains. In one case we have a quantifier or degree adverb, while in the other case we have a deictic locative. And they have very different etymologies and different development paths. Both elements show a compresence of content level and context level uses. And what is interesting is that the context level uses show comparable illocutionary functions to some extent, and comparable distributions in types of speech act. Just a disclaimer, like this presentation is not meant to be a direct comparison between these two elements, because like we saw, like they do not share the same development paths. But with having in mind the objective of giving a better description of this category, modal particle, it is used to investigate how different elements can develop similar pragmatic functions. Okay. So we can start from the modal uses of un po'. I will not discuss them in details so that we have more time to see the Portuguese examples, which are maybe more interesting for today. But anyway, we start from the content level uses of un po', that is the referential uses, which are two. In example 13, un po' is used as a quantifier in pseudo-partitive constructions. It's there. Volevo farti un po' di domande. I wanted to ask you some questions. It is basically used to indicate a quantity of an indefinite set of elements. Un po' di domande, some questions. While the second content level use is the use as a degree modifier, which applies on adverbs, adjectives, and verbal phrases. In 14a, un po' più, un po' meno, a little more, a little less. 14b, mi sento un po' stanco, I feel a little tired. And 14c, mi ha fatto un po' ridere, it made me laugh a bit. No, these are referential uses. No, they have to do with the state of affairs indicated by the utterance. On the other hand, we have different context level uses of the same element. Un po' can appear in directive speech acts, like the one in 15, which is a request with a mitigating overtone. It's a conversation between a teacher and the student, and the teacher asks the student to tell about a collection of Italian folk tales. And the teacher says, these fiabe italiane, che praticamente, ecco, raccontami un po' di cosa sono. So these Italian folk tales, right? Well, tell me about what they are, tell me what they are. Like again, here the teacher is not asking to tell just a part, or like to just give just a partial answer, but it's marking your speech act with un po' to express the request. In 16 there is another directive which is very similar to the other one. The only difference is it's that here, like, it has rather a reinforcing overtone. Like two friends are talking about taking a picture to a screen. The screen is covered with dust, and one friend asks the other to take off the dust from the screen, and he says togli un po' quel dito di polvere. Again, like it's not asking to remove just a part of the dust. No, it's asking like remove the dust, but it's a request, and in this sense it's marked with un po'. Yes. Then un po' also appears in another kind of speech act, which is like very close to directive, which are hortatives, first person plural. Allora, da qui dove andrà? Vediamo un po'. Che ne so, a Berlino forse. Well, from here, where she will go? Let's see. I don't know, to Berlin maybe. No, un po' here explicitly expresses the fact that this vediamo should not be interpreted as a declarative or something else, but as an hortative. Vediamo un po', let's see. And finally, un po' can appear in assertive speech acts with different functions. Here I have two examples, 18 and 19. In 18, we would say that it marks a low commitment on the assertivity of the speech act, in the sense that the speaker doesn't feel really confident about what they are saying, and in this sense mark the utterance with un po'. It's le cose che raccoglie sono un po', vanno un po' in più direzioni. The things she collects are like, they go like in several directions. And there are other contextual clues, like the fillers underline that also point to the fact that the speaker doesn't feel really confident about this, and in this way it marks this assertion as an assertion with a lesser degree of commitment. In the second case, example 19, there are two different occurrences of un po', which are basically very similar to the other one. The second one, the last one, is very similar. The first one, we could argue that it expresses something slightly different, which is approximation. If we think that un po' here is rather connected to a noun phrase, which is the age, l'état, and that the speaker gives an approximate description of what they have in mind. Of course, like it's very hard to distinguish between something like approximation at the sentence level and low assertivity on the illocutionary force. And this, I think, points a bit to this interplay between these two different categories that are in the title of the talk. No, illocutionary force on the one side and information managing on the other. These examples are taken from a corpus survey that I started when I was doing my PhD, and that I'm continuing now that I'm doing the postdoc. And I extracted examples from two different corpora of spoken Italian, which should represent a database of examples for a qualitative analysis. On the left, there are the results of this corpus survey. They are not so important here. It's only to see that the first two rows, which are the content level categories expressed by un po', are much more frequent than the others, no? And in this sense, they can be used to assess the prototypicality of the uses of un po'. On the right side, there is just an overview of the functions expressed by un po'. We saw that it can appear in directive speech acts, which are specified as requests. And moreover, the presence of this particle contributes to mark a speech act or interactional frame where a minimal effort is required on the part of the addressee. And this marks a connection with the original meaning of un po', no? Like a bit, something, which is however transferred to the speech act level, and in this sense it marks a speech act where the speaker underlines the fact that the addressee will not put a lot, like doesn't need to put a lot of effort to achieve the requested action. And besides that, there are other contextual features that can give a mitigating or reinforcing overtone to the speech acts. On the other hand, un po' can appear in hortative speech acts to mark this specific illocution, and it can appear in assertive speech acts to express a continuum of functions from information managing to illocutionary force. In one cluster, one group, the information managing one, we have this approximation function and sometimes even focus marking. And in the other group, the illocutionary force cluster, we saw that the presence of un po contributes to mark a low commitment on the assertivity. Okay, we can move to the Portuguese examples, starting from the prototypical use of la as a deictic locative. The example is on the left, and there are two underlined sentences. The first one is with ka, and the second one is with la, to show that la operate in a binary system of locatives opposed to this other adverb, ka, and basically they perform a special operation, and whereby ka expresses identification with the position of the speaker, and la expresses distance or disconnection. And of course, the speaker is the source of the deictic operation. And in some contexts, because of this, because of the presence of the speaker, this can also correspond to a subjective evaluation of this distance. And this could be seen as the starting point of different development paths, whereby this feature of distancing or disconnection is transferred to other linguistic domains. As this has been said by Pierre and Amalia in one paper that they are preparing. They say that in particular la will be associated with modal values marking some sort of distancing between the enunciator and the situation described, in the sense of nothing to do with me. So these development paths can lead to different context level uses of this adverb, which have been studied by different authors. Here there are some studies, Martins 2012, different papers written by Marques Duarte, and then this paper that I've already cited by Lejeune and Mendes. These papers take different perspectives on the same topic, both from both from the theoretical point of view and the descriptive point of view, and of course they give a lot of very useful insights on this topic. Nevertheless, as it works in scientific research, I think there is some room for improvement, or from, let's say, different perspectives. In particular, I think that sometimes the classifications can be misleading because they present a mix of syntactic and discursive criteria, which of course in this case sometimes are difficult to separate, but in some cases can also be misleading. And sometimes there is lack of reference towards some pragmatic theory, and so in this sense the list of functions that are described for these constructions are kind of vague, and the development paths are not fully explored, and also often there is no reference to a broader model of grammatical categories, which could be useful to compare these functions with the functions expressed by particles in other languages. So this was the idea of doing some more research about this adverb, and I was inspired by the study that I was doing on un po', and so I started to look for examples of la in the spoken subpart of the reference corpus of contemporary Portuguese, with the objective of extracting examples for a qualitative analysis. I was particularly interested in uses with some related to this illocutionary level, so I was targeting examples of la that appears immediately before or immediately after the main verb, to be sure that it has to do with the main verb and possibly with the illocution expressed by the verb. And then I just developed a preliminary classification which was mainly based on the previous literature, on the functions which have been already identified, but with a closer reference to speech act theory. And yes, the corpus research gave 1,371 matches. I've been analyzing the half of it, 700, to virtually equalize the examples of un po', which were 700, but this is just a matter of like symmetry between the two things. And in the table on the left, there are the results of this corpus survey and the different functions and the occurrences of la. This is just, let's say, like it doesn't serve the function of giving some specific idea of, let's say, like it will not be used to perform quantitative analysis of la because it's a preliminary classification, but I think it gives an idea of the proportions between the different uses. No, the deictive locative, the prototypical one has almost 500 uses, and the rest are kind of marginal model uses, which are, however, I think pretty interesting. And yeah, for today, or like for my project, I'm mainly interested in these, and for today especially the directives. But we will give a look at all the three categories, starting from the use of la in assertive speech acts. In example 21, there is an example underlined. We see that in assertive speech acts, la always appears in this kind of syntactic configuration preceding the main verb, which is kind of like a fixed construction. And yeah, it doesn't mark a spatial reference, but rather a subjective stance expressed by the speaker towards the state of affair. In this case, could be something like disappointment or contrariety towards the state of affair. Like the teacher in this case is not happy to do what he has to do, develop the photographies. The second example is very similar to the first one. Again, we see the same constructions, la preceding the main verb, and adding some kind of subjective stance towards the state of affair. I will skip this, which is, however, very similar to the other examples of assertive speech acts, and to move to the directives. La can also appear in directive speech acts, and we can have like a deeper look to these examples. It's like a girl talking about the choice of the faculty at the university, and she's reporting a conversation with her mom and a friend of her mom, and this girl would like to study psychology. The mom would prefer, if I remember well, that she studies law or something because she's worried that she will not find any job after the university. Then the daughter is talking with the friends of the mom, and the friends of the mom is saying, "Man, no, like please, like study psychology. If you don't find any job, then you can move to live with me to my place." And like, is it too small or no? You can read, right? So the mom, like the mother, first warns the friend, saying like, remember what you're saying, don't forget, because if she doesn't find any job, then she will move here. And but yeah, like there is a happy ending, because then like mom and daughter go back home, and when it comes the moment of choosing the university, the mom says to her daughter, poi la psicologia, que é o que tu queres, and marks this directive speech act with la. So with directive, la appears after the main verb and not before, and I would say that it is used to express a specific kind of directive. In this case, we have two different examples. The first one could be seen rather as a warning or a challenge towards his friend, while the second one is more like an encouragement or an exhortation to do this. This is another example. I don't remember if it's teacher-student talk or just an interview, but someone is mentioning that he likes internet, and the other person invites this other person to talk more about this fact, and marks this directive with la again. Discorre lá sobre o internet, a internet. In this case, again, la seems to mark a specific kind of speech act, like an encouragement or exhortation to do something. Last examples of directives. It's a conversation between two men about the movie industry and cinema. In the first part, like one person uses an English expression, know how, because he doesn't find an equivalent expression in Portuguese. Then the conversation goes on for a while, and after sometimes they're talking about something else, and the same person says, porque realmente os americanos hoje têm aquela teoria, deixa-me-la falar inglês outra vez, take the money and run. And making reference to the fact that you already used English, which was maybe not the best choice, and here it marks this exhortation towards his addressee with la. Let me talk in English a second time, another time. And yeah, last case, we see that la can also mark specific illocutionary types, which is like hortative, speech acts, which are very similar to directive in a way, or like to directives expressing exhortation, but at the first person plural. And here there are different examples of them. Vamos lá frisar esta coisa, vamos lá ver o que é, vamos lá conversar sobre isso. Okay. I was saying that for my research so far and for the talk today, I've been looking more specifically to directives, imperative sentences, and in my data I found that la modifies 14 different verbs, and which are reported in the table on the left. Some of these forms appear to be more frequent than others, like the forms with dish, diga, desculpe lá, vê lá, olha lá. This fact indicates that these forms are more conventionalized than the others, probably. And in fact, if we look at some examples of them, we see that in some cases this combination, this construction with the imperative and la, it's like don't really express a directive or a real directive, but they have rather reached a discourse marker status, and they are used in conversation to indicate break and reprise in the conversations, or a reformulation, like in the second one. Foi uma gafe horrível, eu pedi-lhe desculpa, pois apesar de eu lhe ter pedido desculpa, ele foi fazer queixa de mim a seguir. Veja lá. è a única vez que tive assim um episódio realmente desagradável. Like it's not really a directive. Like it's a mark. It's a discourse mark. No, it's used to add something else expressed in a different way. A reformulation marker, basically. Yeah. On the other hand, there are other imperative forms marked by la, which are real directive, and in this case, it looks that the main function of la is to specify the illocutionary force and mark these directives as exhortations. And yeah, in this sense, I would say that like it doesn't have so much to do with the intensity of the illocutionary force, and that mitigation and reinforcement appear to be largely defined by the basic illocutionary features of the utterance, independent of the presence of la or not, or they appear as a contextual side effect. And we can ask ourselves why exhortations, and if there is any contribution of this other category, information managing, in this. And so exhortation can be seen as a double directive or a repeated directive, no? Something that it's not expressed for the same time, for the first time, because like you are either referring to a directive that already appeared in the conversation or to something that you have in mind. But in this sense, the presence of la marks a non-initial directive, which doesn't come out of the blue in conversation, but it is rather reiterated or reaffirmed with respect to something else that can be some assumption about the interlocutor state of mind, in the sense that it can represent an anticipation of a reaction, like the example with the English. No, you anticipate the fact that your addressee cannot be happy with the fact that you are talking English for the second time, and you, in this sense, you mark an exhortation, no? Because you refer to a reaction that you have in your mind. Or it can refer to some element in the common ground shared by interlocutors, like the example with the mom and the daughter. Like here, it is explicitly expressed by the mom what she has in mind, like put psychology, sign up for psychology, because this is what you want. This is our shared knowledge of the fact, and in this sense I can perform an exhortation and not just an order or a simple directive. Or la can appear in interactional frames which are very much codified, such as interviews or talks between teacher and student, where exhortations are the rule, in the sense that it is clear that there are different roles in these interactional frames, and it is expected to highlight a specific kind of directive. And yes, so this fact seems to be enabled by the deictic potential of la, which is transferred to the interactional plane, and in this way the presence of the adverb points to specific aspects of the interactional context, not to some special or textual element, but to some proposition or some feature of the interaction or interactional context or common ground shared by the interlocutors. And in this way it specifies how the directive should be interpreted in the relevant interactional context. For what concerns assertive speech acts, this will represent a future step in my analysis, but I'm planning to do something similar, so to have a look at the lexical forms modified by la, to check recurrent patterns, and then pragmatic functions. And in particular, it could be interesting to also check this other use of la. The first one, underlined in red. In this case, it doesn't really operate on the verb, but rather on a noun phrase. And in this case, like in the literature, it has been said that this corresponds to a function of approximation. And it could be interesting to check whether there is a connection between this function of approximation on noun phrase and the use of la in assertive speech acts, such as the examples that we've been seeing before. No, here there are the two different things, las reivindicações, and the second one, it operates on the verb again with subjective stance. Okay, we can skip this and move to the final part of the talk, and give a brief comparative overview of the functions that we've been talking so far. So we can first point out some common features of these constructions. We saw that despite different etymologies and different content level uses, the context level uses of these two elements show some similarities. And it's interesting to notice that we can find them, at least in this corpus data, because la can appear also in interrogative speech acts, but at least in the corpus data, here we find it in directive, hortative, and assertive speech acts. And un po presents a very comparable distribution. Moreover, they appear in conventionalized constructions, which are more or less the same. Like the Italian vediamo un po', at least in some contexts, is a pretty good equivalent of vamos lá ver in Portuguese. Di un po' e diz lá sound very similar in some contexts, and also guarda un po', senti un po', and olha là are very similar. So we saw that these constructions involve two related pragmatic functions, pragmatic functionalist domain, that I have called illocutionary force or illocutionary force modification, and information managing. The first category refers to something like mitigation and reinforcement of the illocutionary force, the marking of specific illocutionary types, such as hortative, or specification of illocutionary types, a directive that is marked as a request or as an exhortation. The second category indicates rather the management of common ground information, contextual assumptions, and the marking of specific interactional frames. No? So then another shared functional features between these two constructions is the marking of approximation, in the sense of vagueness or non-straightforward communication, both at the sentence level and at the level of noun phrase. Overall, it appears that these domains correspond pretty well to the functions expressed by German modal particles. And so I would say that these features suggest that Italian un po' and Portuguese la can be included in the list of Romance modal particles. Then, of course, the relationship between these three functional domains needs further research, especially in terms of position in a general model of grammatical categories, which is the point on which I would like to close the talk. What we can try to do now is to put the functions that we identified for the examples today in a model of grammatical categories. This is a possibility, is like the layered model of grammatical categories developed in functional discourse grammar, which is something that I sometimes use. It's not necessary to fully understand this table. What is relevant is to see that the interpersonal level in functional discourse grammar corresponds more or less to what we called context level uses or context level categories today, while the representational level corresponds to the content level categories, such as modality, tense, aspect, and so on. Then we have 4 different layers or categories: discourse act, illocution, communicated content, ascriptive, subact. And the first 2 layers, discourse act, illocution, correspond more or less to the category that in this talk has been indicated by illocutionary force, while the 2 other layers, communicated content and ascriptive subact, corresponds more or less to information managing. In each layer there are different functions coded. No? Under discourse act there is irony, mitigation and reinforcement. Under illocution there is basic illocution, illocutionary modification. Communicated content and ascriptive subact, it's empty, but if we look at another version of the same table, it's just another paper, they have different versions, but we do find approximation, which is something that we've been talking about both for UMPO and for LA. And so if we combine these 2 different things, we get something like this. No, we have layers related to the illocutionary force modification and layers related to information managing and approximation. And what we can do now is basically just to picture the functions that we found today for UMPO and LA on this table. And so we see that among these 4 layers, UMPO can mark illocutionary modification and basic illocution, approximation, and approximation at the ascriptive subact. Let's say that this one is when it operates just on the noun phrase, and the other approximation is when it operates on the whole sentence. And something similar can be done for Portuguese LA. Like the distribution is very similar, no? The only difference is the fact that for LA we should also include the metalinguistic negation, which corresponds to constructions like sei lá or quero lá saber. And yes, that's it. We can like this is just meant to highlight the fact that if we bring these functions, if we compare them with a model of grammatical categories, it's much easier to compare functions of particles in different languages. And we can jump to our conclusions. So we saw that despite the fact that they come from very different source constructions, UMPO and LA show a certain similarity in their context level uses. The functions displayed by these uses can lead to classify them as modal particles, and they count as examples of Romance modal particles, and in this sense I think they represent a good contribution to a cross-linguistic investigation of this category. And the analysis that I presented relied on the tools developed by speech-act theory, interactional linguistics, and functional discourse grammar. And I think that the analysis of the functions contribute to better outline the pragmatic domains that are involved in the description of modal particles in a cross-linguistic perspective, that is illocutionary force, information managing, and possibly approximation. And for the future, for what concerns my personal project, I will have a better look at LA in assertive speech acts, possibly extracting more data if it is necessary, but maybe not. And I will try to look also at the examples where LA marks approximation and possibly some conventionalized constructions. But apart from these, more in general, it's clear that it could be interesting to see more in general at the pragmatic development of deictive expressions at a typological level. I couldn't find many references on that, and we could include a conversation analysis perspective on these topics, a diachronic perspective. I haven't done anything on that, but it could be interesting to see if it is possible to identify bridging context from one function to the other, especially because, yeah, like also the syntactic position is interesting. No, it would be interesting to understand why the modal use of la in assertive emerges when la precedes the main verb, and finally we could see at dialectal data, or in general a sociolinguistic perspective, to check if these uses are more used among different group of speakers. That's it. Thank you.